Hey guys, so we're going to start today's lecture with a ghost story, which is super appropriate considering that tomorrow is Halloween. And we get to tell this lovely ghost story because it's actually part of the question of the day. What is responsible for the haunting of Mrs. H? All right, well, here's the story of Mrs. H. So Mrs. H was a patient of a prominent ophthalmologist in the early 1900s. She told him the story. He recorded it, but shortened her last name to only H so her and her family could keep their privacy. This is a true story. Okay, so here we go. It's 1912 in Washington, D.C., and Mrs. H and her family move into a new home. It's a very large home, but it's a little bit run down, and it's not updated with some of the amenities that had begun to be more prevalent at the time. So it didn't have any electricity. Perfect for a ghost story. No electricity. Gas lamps were used for lighting, and a giant old furnace was used for heating. And they moved in with their family and their servants, and pretty quickly after moving in, they started having these strange occurrences. Let me read one of them to you. This is Mrs. H. This is a quote for telling this story. One morning I heard footsteps in the room over my head. I hurried up the stairs. To my surprise, the room was empty. I passed into the next room and into all the rooms on that floor and then to the floor above to find that I was the only person in that part of the house. Amazing. We have the beginning of what every ghost story needs, which is the phantom footsteps. But she was the only one that had these strange situations happen to her. Her husband also began to experience some things. For instance, he would sit at dinner with his back facing the hallway, and soon the feeling of somebody standing immediately behind him was so intense that he would turn his chair around and sit facing the hall so that nobody could sneak up on him. The servants also were having strange occurrences happen to them. They had the feeling that they were being followed. As they would go about their jobs, they felt like somebody was about to grab them from behind. And they also heard noises at night. It sounded like tinkling and rattling china, heavy footsteps walking on the upstairs floors, and furniture being dragged across floors and up against doors. So lots of big noises that they're hearing at night. Then came the apparitions. This is Mrs. H again. On one occasion in the middle of the morning, as I passed from the drawing room into the dining room, I was surprised to see at the further end of the drawing room, coming towards me, a strange woman, dark-haired and dressed in black. As I walked steadily into the dining room to meet her, she disappeared. And then Mrs. H says, this happened 3 different times. On another occasion, Mr. and Mrs. H went to the opera. When they came back from the opera, they went to bed, but Mr. H was awoken fairly quickly by the sensation of ghostly fingers closing around his neck to strangle him. He also often heard ringing bells at night, as well as the feeling and the sounds of people moving through the house. And he always thought that these were intruders, but every time he got up to confront the would-be burglars, there was nobody there. I'm going to pause there at our ghost Halloween story / question of the day. And I'll pick it up again. There we go. When we get back to the question of the day, see if you have guessed what was the cause of the haunting. Okay, in the meantime, let us talk about red blood cells. All right, so fill in the blanks. The formed elements of blood include, oops, where's my ball? Okay. Include red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Formed elements are produced in the red bone marrow, which contains stem cells. Okay, you can kind of see a breakdown of percentage by weight when it comes to blood, and then there's also one that's percentage by volume. All right, so let's talk about plasma. Plasma is not one of the formed elements of blood. It is a liquid medium for carrying formed elements as well as various other substances. We have about 91% of the plasma being water, and another 9% that consists of salts, ions, and different organic molecules, such as the ones listed here. The purpose of some of these organic molecules, well, we have salt, which helps to maintain the osmotic pressure. And if you remember from heart and blood vessel lecture, osmotic pressure is a big deal when it comes to the exchange of wastes at the capillaries. The salt also acts as a buffer to help maintain the pH of blood. The plasma contains glucose, amino acids, gases, hormones, and wastes. Plasma proteins act as a buffer to help keep the blood pH around 7.4, which is just about neutral. Plasma proteins are too large to pass through capillary walls, thus they remain in the blood, establishing, and again, osmotic pressure. This is because water wants to follow wherever the solutes are. Okay. Moving on. Erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells. Durable and flexible. They have the ability to alter shape slightly to get through some of the more narrow vessels, but they're also durable enough to withstand the high pressure as they pass through arteries. They carry hemoglobin protein, which the hemoglobin is going to be the part that binds oxygen. But you know the story, there was an old lady who swallowed a fly, or the song, if you learned it that way. How hemoglobin carries oxygen is a little bit like the little old lady who swallowed a fly. Okay, because she swallowed the bird and the cat and then the dog, and I forget where we go from there. But that's kind of what's going to happen. You'll see what I mean. So we're going to carry the hemoglobin protein. The hemoglobin protein is made up of 4 protein chains. And this is the globin molecule part. Okay. From there, though, we have heme that's going to attach to the globin. So the globin is like the fly. Now here we go. We're going to start attaching stuff. Okay. That means that there are 4 heme molecules per hemoglobin. Okay. Next level. Each heme binds an iron. Yes, iron, not oxygen. For a total of 4 for hemoglobin. And then finally, we get to, where would we be at? The fly, the bird, the cat, the dog that went to get the cat. Because now each iron binds 1 oxygen. For a total of 4. Okay? Again, see what I mean? We had to have, we'll start with the globin that has a heme molecule attached to it. The heme binds iron, and then the iron binds oxygen. There you go. Okay. Oxyhemoglobin. This is hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen. It's oxygenated, kind of, if you will. Mo. And then you can probably guess that deoxyhemoglobin is not bound to oxygen. It's actually going to be bound to carbon dioxide here. Okay. Oxygen actually forms a weak covalent bond with heme. Why is this important? Well, what is oxygen supposed to do? We breathe it in, it's supposed to go to the blood or be carried by the blood to go where? Okay, so it's got to be carried by the tissues, or geez, it's got to be dropped off at the tissues, right? Remember the whole photosynthesis? Good gosh, you guys. Remember the photosynthesis things that humans don't do? We don't do photosynthesis. We do cellular respiration. I should probably quit talking now, but alas, we're not done. Hang in there with me. Okay, oxygen has to be taken by the blood to the tissues where it's dropped off for cellular respiration. Okay, so the reason that it forms a weak covalent bond is because it has to be dropped off. If it binds too strongly to the heme, to the iron specifically, it's going to be hard for it to be used by the tissues because it's going to be difficult to detach it from the hemoglobin molecule. Okay. I'm going to put cells. However, carbon monoxide actually forms a very strong covalent bond with heme. It's an oxygen hog when it comes to heme molecules, okay? And it keeps oxygen from being able to bind to it. Oh. Okay, and hang on. There we go. It's carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. So the next question is, how come it has such a strong bond with carbon monoxide, which also has oxygen, but a weaker bond with the oxygen that we need in the tissues? It just has to do with the fact that carbon monoxide only has one oxygen, whereas the O2 oxygen molecule that we use has two oxygens. So it's kind of how chemically those electrons between those molecules interact with each other. And because there's only one oxygen in carbon monoxide, it just is able to form a stronger bond with the heme molecule. Okay, so what this means is, we've all heard about carbon monoxide poisoning. Low exposure can cause a variety of different issues, from nausea to dizziness, headaches. However, if the exposure level increases, people can also begin to experience hallucinations, both auditory and visual. So auditory hallucinations, if that's not a term you've heard very much, auditory hallucinations is just where you are hearing things instead of seeing things, okay? Obviously, with high levels of exposure, prolonged exposure, it causes death, okay? Hey, here comes our question of the day. What is responsible for the haunting of Mrs. H? Can you guess now? In those days, I'm reading you the end of this ghost story. In those days, doctors still made house calls, so eventually when the physician came around to examine the H family, he also took a look around their home. As soon as he examined the old furnace in the basement, his suspicions and those of another family member were confirmed. He found the furnace in very bad condition. The combustion being imperfect, the fumes, instead of going up the chimney, were pouring gases of carbon monoxide into our rooms, Mrs. H reported. The doctor advised us not to let the children sleep in the house another night. If they did, he said we might find in the morning that some of them would never wake up. So carbon monoxide poisoning is what was responsible for the haunting of Mrs. H. She wasn't actually being haunted. Of course, or rather she was, but by imaginings of her own mind due to consistent, moderate exposure to carbon monoxide. Okay. Today we have carbon monoxide sensors, which are super helpful because any home that has access to natural gas is at risk for carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, so how are erythrocytes, or red blood cells, produced? I'm glad you asked. We've already talked about the fact that they're made in the red bone marrow from stem cells. And this little diagram here is showing how that happens. We have stem cells in the bone marrow, and then you can see how they differentiate into several different types of cells. And I will go into this a little bit more when we talk about white blood cells, because there's many different types. But then we have the erythroblasts, which eventually give rise to the erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells. Okay. Notice that there's another type of stem cell or precursor that is going to turn into the platelets. Okay. Then we have something called erythropoietin, or EPO. This is secreted by the kidneys and it signals the stem cells in the red bone marrow to produce red blood cells. So essentially, the EPO is the signal that says we need to make more red blood cells here. Okay. And the kidneys are the ones to do this because, well, when we get into the kidneys, we'll see a little bit more about it. But basically, the kidneys are these constant monitors of the blood because it all has to circulate and filter through the kidneys. And so it helps to kind of keep an eye on the different levels of things in our body. Okay, so we're going to answer these questions. Is red blood cell formation negative or positive feedback? This is negative feedback because the stimulus for creating red blood cells is to have low oxygen, okay? But then when we create the red blood cells, the oxygen levels rise. And so we have negative feedback loop there. Negative. Why do athletes like to train in high elevation? Hint, high elevation equals low oxygen. Essentially what this means is because of this low oxygen in the blood, creating or stimulating the stem cells to make more red blood cells, when an athlete trains at a higher elevation where there is lower oxygen in their blood because there's just lower oxygen in their surroundings, the negative feedback loop starts saying, hey, we need to increase the number of red blood cells we have. Well, the more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen you can fix, the more oxygen you can pick up and carry, right? The more oxygen you can carry, the more energy you generate through cellular respiration. So this increases an athlete's endurance by teaching the body to be more efficient at carrying oxygen. So put endurance and more efficient. It is illegal for a professional athlete to inject EPO. What is the advantage to injecting EPO? Well, we already know. EPO signals the stem cells to create more red blood cells. More red blood cells means you fix more oxygen. More oxygen means the production of more energy in cellular respiration and in these metabolic pathways. It's called blood doping. And you are artificially increasing your body's ability to, well, again, carry oxygen and then have all of those physical benefits from having done that. So it is illegal. The other thing that it can cause, in addition to that unfair advantage, is just the fact that in normal elevations, when there's plenty of oxygen available and your body doesn't need to pick up more oxygen, what you're really just doing is hogging the road with red blood cells, the road being blood vessels. So it causes the blood to thicken because of all the new red blood cells that are being generated, and it can cause a blood clot, which can cause a stroke. My gosh, can cause a stroke and can lead to death. Okay, so it's illegal, unfair advantage. Also, you might die. There you go. Okay. To continue. As they mature, they make hemoglobin and they lose their nucleus and their organelles, including their mitochondria. Okay, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. This is where energy and ATP are generated. So how do erythrocytes get their ATP? Through fermentation reactions, which is simply glycolysis, the first step of cellular respiration on repeat, because it doesn't require oxygen, it's anaerobic. Red blood cells stay in the bloodstream for 120 days. They have a relatively short lifespan before they are recycled. They're usually taken to either the liver or the spleen and are broken down by macrophages. Which is what you're seeing here. Macrophages are a type of white blood cell that we'll talk about in the next lecture, I believe. Okay, so the hemoglobin is also broken down, but the hemoglobin, parts of it are recycled to build more. Okay, how does blood clotting work when you get a cut? Well, I'm going to tell you. First, we're going to start with our platelets, which are also called thrombocytes. And these platelets are essentially cell fragments, okay? Made from stem cells. So they're essentially like a membrane with some cytoplasm. The formation of the clot requires these platelets, as well as calcium and 13 different clotting factors that are all involved in stopping the bleeding. Okay, So clotting factors are all proteins. Which are carried in the plasma. Barely fit. Okay. The platelets, or I'm sorry, no, I'm not on that part yet. So the clotting factors are proteins in the plasma, the blood plasma. And then what happens is it's like a domino effect where one clotting factor activates the next. When the next one is activated, it activates the next one in line. Okay. So you have to have each protein in this series for clotting to work correctly. Because if you only have, let's say that you've got, you number them 1 through 13, and you have number 1, 2, and 3, but something's wrong with number 4. Okay, that means that the clotting factors only go up to level 3 and then stop. And all of the rest of them aren't activated because there's something wrong with number 4. Okay. Okay. All right. So in forming a blood clot, we're going to have platelets that are going to surround the injury. And the platelets are going to partially close that off, okay, because they're there. But the other thing it's going to do is secrete something called a prothrombin factor. Okay. Why did I put factor? I meant activator. Because I'm listening to my little son in the background singing a creepy song from Five Nights at Freddy's. Okay, so we have this activator plus calcium plus prothrombin. That equals thrombin in the blood. Okay. Then we have thrombin plus something called fibronectin plus calcium, and then we get these fibrin threads. And the fibrin threads act like a net, okay? That's actually going to trap the blood cells. Okay, so over here, this image is showing the red blood cells that are caught in this fibrin net to form this clot. Okay, let's look at some blood disorders, including what happens if you happen to be missing some of those essential clotting factors. We already know that we have to have one activating the next, so you can't be missing any. You can't have any not working. If any of them work, or I'm sorry, if any of them don't work, you could end up with a genetic disorder known as hemophilia. This has a couple of other names: bleeder's disease. This was also known as the Royal's disease for a while. And that's because this is a genetic disorder. And because royalty had to marry royalty, there was a decent amount of inbreeding. I think I already went over this actually in our genetics section. But anyway, in case I didn't, since royalty had to marry royalty, this mutation that would cause hemophilia was passed on to their offspring. So the royal family pretty soon had a lot of individuals that had hemophilia. There's different types of hemophilia, but they're about missing a clotting factor. This used to cause death a lot of times for, well, not just kids, but adults too, because even, I mean, think of how many times we accidentally, hit our elbow against something during the day, or our knee or your leg or whatever, we end up with a bruise, right? Bruises are internal bleeding beneath the tissues. So for somebody that has hemophilia, that bleeding that should cause a bruise causes massive internal bleeding because there's nothing to stop it, okay? So it often led to death, especially in childhood, because, I mean, not necessarily because it was something that targeted children, but just because you tended to have more injuries and more bleeding than your body could deal with, so you never had a chance to get to be older. Today, treatment involves the injection of the clotting factors that are missing. And because there are different types, there are different tests that are done to determine exactly which type of hemophilia a person has so that they receive the right clotting factor. Okay, thromboembolism. A blood clot. And a piece of a blood clot that has the ability to move. Okay, so we've talked about atherosclerosis. That this can cause blood clots. Okay, thrombus is the medical term for a blood clot. Okay, when a thrombus, blood clot, is dislodged or when it moves, you have an embolus. Okay, and so when you have a thromboembolism, you have a blood clot that's now on the move. And this is scary because depending on where it ends up, it can lead to either a stroke or a heart attack. It can end up near the heart, it can get to the lungs, get to the brain, and thromboembolisms are often deadly, which is why we talked about blood clot treatment in an earlier lecture, and blood thinners and things like that, to try to keep a thromboembolism from being deadly. Okay. One of the reasons I talk about aspirin, I don't know if you've seen those commercials, if they even still do them anymore, but about like aspirin being able to save a life at the first signs of a heart attack. It's because aspirin, just as part of its chemical makeup, inhibits platelet aggregation, or in other words, it keeps platelets from clumping up together. So another word for that is an anticoagulant. Okay, so it helps to discourage clots. We can't say 100% prevents, but it really helps to decrease their likelihood. Jaundice, we've talked about this before a little bit as well. This is an accumulation of bilirubin in the tissues. And this is what has the symptoms that cause yellowing of the whites of the eyes and of the skin, of the stool, stuff like that. And remember that that's because the liver is responsible for breaking some of those heme molecules down in the red blood cells, breaking them down into this byproduct called bilirubin. And so if something is wrong with the liver, it doesn't have the ability to do that. And so it can build up. Or yeah, what happens after the liver is supposed to be doing that gets disrupted. And so bilirubin builds up and causes this discoloration in the tissues instead. Okay. So at this point, I will pause to say, at this point, I'm hoping that you can kind of see how one body system is so impacted by another. That the nervous system works with the musculoskeletal system, which works with the circulatory system. We talked about the skeletal muscle pumps. All of that works then with the nervous system again. It works with the digestive system. All of these things, respiratory, it all works together. And so if you have something go wrong in one part of the body, that's why you end up having trickle-down symptoms in other areas. When we get to the kidneys, you'll find, again, that the kidneys have a role in almost everything in our body. They interact with almost every other system. And so if something happens with the kidneys, it's easy then to have multiple issues across other body systems. Because if one thing goes down, it causes problems for multiple other ones. So, I mean, just in these lectures alone, I've talked about cellular respiration a number of times. We've talked about osmosis and osmotic pressures. We've talked about nutrients getting to the tissues and to the cells. Those nutrients come from the digestive tract. We've already talked about the digestive tract and where those nutrients get absorbed and how each part of the digestive tract has different enzymes to break down those specific macromolecules into those nutrients. We've talked about the liver. We talked about jaundice and bilirubin when it came to, again, digestive system. Here we are looking at it when it comes to red blood cells. We're looking at where that heme comes from. We're looking at the fact that bilirubin comes from breaking down heme that's been broken down from red blood cells after their 121-day life cycle. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get across is all of these things come to work together in this complex biological network where any one thing has the ability to cause issues for a multitude of other things. The point of this type of class isn't just to make you memorize stuff, or isn't just to make you be like, I know what happens to blood after it leaves the left ventricle. That's all important as well. But really what the class is trying to do is to help you process through how the body works as a whole. You guys that are going into any type of medicine, you need to be able to take what you know of the body systems and apply that to what's happening in a patient. Okay, this patient might have kidney disease, but why is that causing high blood pressure? Or maybe a patient has high blood pressure, but why has that led to, a stroke, right? So try the best you can as you go through these sections to take what we're learning in this lecture and find where it connects to the lectures we've already had. What information are we talking about in this lecture that we've heard about in another one, even on an unrelated topic? The more you can do that and understand how the body works together, frankly, the easier your time will be as you continue through the rest of your schooling. For you guys that are either pre-med or going into nursing program, EMT, dental, all of that. The more you can see the body as one large complex network, but also understand the little parts that make it up, really the easier your education is going to be. So try to get in the habit of doing that now as much as you can. Try to shift away from memorizing and spitting answers back out to understanding processes and how one process affects another. All right. That really is my advice. That is one thing I see students struggle with every single semester, is trying to switch from, frankly, what has been taught in high schools for a long time, memorize this, tell me again on the test, to switching over to having to practice more application-based thinking. And so the more you can learn to do that now, the better it will be. And the easier your time will be, because you'll kind of be getting what you're supposed to be doing and how this works. All right, I will quit talking. But let me know if you have questions on anything. As always, let me know if you're struggling with something. And happy Halloween. I'll see you soon.